Story 1. I was working front desk at a hotel when a Karen stormed in screaming that a family stole her parking spot. She wanted us to call the police, and when we told her absolutely not, she dialed them herself like she was summoning backup in a war zone. When officers arrived, she immediately pointed at the innocent family and yelled, "Arrest them." The cops asked her what the emergency was. She said, "They disrespected me." One officer blinked and said, "That's not illegal." "Ma'am." She kept screaming until she pushed one of the officers in the chest, trying to direct him toward the criminals. They cuffed her on the spot. She screamed, "You can't arrest a customer." The officer said, "We are not a store." Story 2. Back when I was working at a grocery store, I watched a Karen completely lose her mind because another customer wouldn't let her cut the line. She shoved her cart into the man's heels, screamed that she was in pain and needed priority, and then called the cops claiming she had been assaulted by a violent man. The man literally hadn't touched her. When officers arrived and saw the security footage, Karen smiled confidently like she thought it would support her story. The footage showed her ramming his legs and then pretending to fall dramatically like she was auditioning for a soap opera. The officers turned to her and said, "Ma'am, do you want to change your statement before this becomes a false report?" She doubled down. They arrested her while she yelled, "Why are you believing the camera and not me?" Story 3. A Karen came into our small-town diner and demanded we remove a couple who were quietly speaking Spanish. She kept saying they were plotting something and that she felt unsafe. We said no. She kept escalating until she called the police and told them there were suspicious foreigners threatening the restaurant. The officers showed up ready for something serious. Instead, they found a couple eating pancakes and a Karen standing on a chair screaming at them like a deranged pterodactyl. The officer listened for 30 seconds and then said, "Ma'am, the only threat here is your imagination." She tried to argue and ended up calling the officer un-American, which went great considering he was very American. They arrested her for misuse of emergency services. As they escorted her out, she yelled, "This country is going downhill," and the Spanish-speaking couple raised their coffee mugs in her honor. Story 4. I was a lifeguard at a community pool when a Karen demanded I kick out a teenage girl for splashing too much. It was a pool. The girl hadn't even been near her. Karen called the cops, claiming the teen attacked her with water. And when the cops arrived and realized she called them because she got wet at a pool, you could see their souls physically leave their bodies. They told her this wasn't a criminal matter. She screamed that they were failing their duties and threw her water bottle at one of them. That was enough. They cuffed her, and as she was being walked out, she yelled, "I pay your salary," to which the cop replied, "Not anymore." Story 5. A Karen at the dog park tried to take someone else's dog because she said the breed was too cute to belong to regular people. When the owner confronted her, she said the dog looked sad with them, and she was rescuing it. She called the cops claiming the owners were abusive. When officers arrived, the dog ran straight to its owners and hid behind their legs. Karen grabbed the leash and tried to yank the dog toward her. Officers immediately stepped in. She tried to argue that she had spiritual custody over animals because they respond to her energy. The cop calmly said, "Ma'am, the dog hates you." They arrested her for attempted theft. She cried louder than the dog. Story 6. When I worked at a movie theater, a Karen accused us of poisoning her popcorn with chemicals. It was butter. She threw the tub at a teenager working concessions and then called the police demanding we be shut down. When officers arrived, she dramatically claimed we attacked her with a toxic substance. The butter had literally melted all over her shirt, forming a giant yellow stain that made her look like a sunburned egg yolk. We showed the officers the footage of her throwing the popcorn first. She tried to say the footage was edited. The officers turned to her and said, "Ma'am, you're being detained." She wailed, "For what?" The officer said, "For your performance." Story 7. I worked at a hardware store where a Karen got mad because we wouldn't let her return a hammer that she had very clearly used to destroy something. It was covered in white drywall powder and had dents all over it. When we refused the return, she called the cops and said we stole her money. Officers showed up and asked her if she had used the hammer. She said, with full confidence, "No, the hammer attacked my wall on its own." The cops stared at her like she had spoken in tongues. One officer finally said, "Ma'am, this is not how reality works." She shouted that they were taking the store's side, so they arrested her for filing a false police report. Story 8. A Karen in my neighborhood called the cops on kids selling lemonade, claiming they were disrupting the peace. The officers showed up, bought lemonade, tipped them, and told the kids they were doing great. Karen was furious. She began screaming at the officers that they were enabling juvenile delinquents. When she started screaming in a cop's face and poking him in the chest, they gave her one warning. She poked him again. They arrested her right there on the sidewalk. The kids offered the cops free lemonade for life. Story 9. I worked at a clothing store where a Karen called the police because we wouldn't let her use her obviously fake coupon. It said 90% off everything forever in Comic Sans. When cops arrived, she proudly presented the coupon like it was the Constitution. The officer looked at it, looked at her, and said, "Ma'am, this has a smiley face in the expiration box." She started yelling that everyone was in on a conspiracy to ruin her day. When she refused to leave the store and tried grabbing items off the rack in front of the officers, they arrested her so smoothly that the rest of us applauded. Story 10. A Karen at a park called the police because a couple was having a picnic too close to her aura. She said their presence was disturbing her spiritual energy. Police arrived expecting a real issue. Instead, they found a Karen screaming at two people quietly eating sandwiches. When she refused to calm down and started chanting about citizens' arrests, the officers finally said, "Ma'am, the only person getting arrested today is you." She screamed, "The universe will punish you." The officer said, "We'll take our chances." Story 11. Back when I worked at a lakeside campground, a Karen absolutely detonated because someone placed their tent too close to her imaginary property line. She walked over, kicked their cooler, and started drawing a border in the dirt with a stick like she was establishing a new country. When the family refused to move, she called the cops and claimed they invaded her land. When officers arrived and learned she didn't actually own any land there, she started screaming. "I spiritually leased this area," the officer said. "That is not a thing." She shoved him while insisting it was. He said, "This is a thing," and handcuffed her. Story 12. I was working as a cashier at a pharmacy when a Karen threw a fit because we wouldn't sell her prescription without ID. She started yelling that the customer is the authority and called the cops saying we were withholding life-saving medication. When the police arrived, she pointed at me and shouted, "Arrest him for discrimination." The cops asked for her ID. She refused again, saying she didn't believe in ID. The cop said, "We don't believe in false reports. They told her to leave." She refused. She was arrested while yelling, "This is a free country." And the cop responded, "Yes, free, not imaginary." Story 13. I was supervising a dog-friendly cafe when a Karen started yelling because someone's Great Dane drooled slightly near her purse. She screamed that the dog was emotionally attacking her belongings. She called the cops and claimed a giant beast tried to bite her. Officers arrived expecting a mauling. Instead, they saw a droopy Great Dane laying on his back like a lazy dinosaur and a Karen screaming at his paws. They asked her to demonstrate the attack. She barked at them. The dog barked back. She flinched. They arrested her for filing a false report. The dog got a treat. Story 14. When I worked at a mall kiosk, a Karen grabbed a bunch of bracelets and tried to walk off. I reminded her she hadn't paid yet. She spun around and shouted, "This is a test to see if you are honest." Then she called the cops and said I had violently trapped her and was holding her against her will. I was literally standing still behind the counter. The officers reviewed security footage, saw her bizarre test, and asked if she wanted to update her statement. She said, "No, my truth is my truth." They said, "Our truth is charges," and arrested her. Story 15. At a beach resort, a Karen lost it because a family refused to give her their rented umbrella. She insisted the resort had a first come, first served unless I want it policy. She called the cops and claimed the family stole her shade. The officers arrived, heard the story, looked at the completely normal umbrella situation, and told her to leave the family alone. She refused and tried to snatch the umbrella pole, hitting a cop's leg in the process. Instant cuffs. She yelled, "I was stealing it peacefully." The officer said, "That's not a sentence people say." Story 16. I used to work at a frozen yogurt shop. A Karen went ballistic because her topping cup wasn't filled to the rim like in the photos. She said we were committing food fraud and called 911. When police showed up, she proudly pointed to the photo menu above our heads. The officer asked her if she understood what serving suggestion meant. She said, "Yes, it suggests you serve it like that." The officer said, "No, ma'am. That's not how English works." She called him a yogurt sympathizer and tried to storm out but slipped on her own spilled sprinkles. They arrested her while she claimed she was a victim of dessert violence. Story 17. I was a ride operator at a theme park when a Karen started shouting because she was asked to remove her giant floppy hat before boarding a roller coaster. Safety rules. She refused and said she would call the cops because we were violating her American freedoms. She actually dialed 911 and said we were restraining her enjoyment. The officers arrived, heard the complaint, and said, "Lady, it's a hat." She jabbed her finger into one officer's chest and shouted, "I do not bow to tyrants." He said, "Good, because you're going downtown, not bowing." She was removed from the park. Story 18. At my old apartment complex, a Karen called the cops because kids were drawing chalk flowers on the sidewalk. Flowers. She claimed the children were defacing federal property. The officer who showed up took one look and said, "This is chalk." She insisted chalk was gateway vandalism. The cop told her to let the kids play. She screamed at him, grabbed the chalk from a child's hand and snapped it dramatically. The officer said, "All right, that's enough," and arrested her while the kids whispered, "Whoa." Story 19. I was working at a farmer's market when a Karen accused a honey vendor of scamming people with bee juice. She insisted honey didn't naturally come in jars, so the operation must be illegal. She called the police to report honey fraud. When the officers arrived, the beekeeper calmly explained where honey comes from. Karen said, "Bees don't make that much." The officer asked, "How many bees have you interviewed?" She stomped her foot and demanded he arrest the beekeeper. Instead, he arrested her for harassment. The bees won that day. Story 20. I managed a small bar where a Karen refused to pay her tab because she believed her margarita should have been free after the emotional stress of waiting. She called the cops screaming that we had kidnapped her credit card. The officers arrived, asked what happened, and we played her the CCTV audio of her shouting, "I'm not paying, make me." The officer turned to her and said, "He doesn't need to make you. We can." She tried to bolt for the door and tripped over a bar stool. They arrested her gently, mostly because she couldn't get up. Story 21. When I was managing a gym, a Karen lost her mind because another woman was using her treadmill. We don't assign treadmills. She got in the woman's face, started yelling inches away from her, and then slapped the emergency stop button so hard it almost ripped off. She called the cops claiming the other woman physically removed her from her equipment. When officers watched the footage and saw her storm across the gym like a gremlin on espresso, they asked her why she lied. She tried saying, "I felt emotionally pushed." One cop replied, "That's not a use of force, ma'am." When she shoved past him to leave, he said, "That is," and cuffed her. Story 22. Back when I worked in apartment security, a Karen called the police because our maintenance worker wouldn't unclog her sink instantly. He told her he had 4 emergency tickets ahead of her. She screamed that she would get him fired by force of law. She called 911 claiming he had threatened her life with tools. The cops arrived expecting a man with a weapon. Instead, they found an elderly maintenance guy holding a wrench like he was fixing a bicycle. When officers realized she lied, they warned her. She called one of them a lazy clown in a costume. They arrested her so fast she didn't finish the sentence. Story 23. I used to work at a brunch place where a Karen insisted her avocado toast was undercooked. Avocados, undercooked. She demanded the plate be comped, the server be fired, and the chef be inspected by authorities. When we refused, she called the cops and reported that the food was unsafe for human consumption. Then he said, "Tastes like avocado." Karen started screeching that he was taking sides and threw her water at him. She was arrested mid-rant while yelling, "I know my rights about avocados." Oh. Story 24. At the local dog beach, a Karen kept shouting at everyone to control their animals, while her dog was the only one actually causing trouble. Her dog kept knocking over beach chairs, stealing towels, and barking non-stop. When someone asked her politely to leash him, she called the police and claimed her dog was under attack by hostile strangers. The cops arrived to find her dog happily chewing on someone's flip-flop, while 4 calm dogs sat nearby staring at him like he was insane. The cops told her to leash her dog. She refused. When she tried to walk away, the dog bolted and tripped her. She hit the sand and screamed, "Assault!" And the cop said, "Yes, your own dog assaulted you." She was arrested for refusing lawful instruction. Story 25. I worked night shift at a gas station when a Karen marched in screaming that the pump stole her vibes. I still don't know what that meant. She said the pump charged her twice, which it didn't, and she wanted me arrested for participating in corporate fraud. When officers arrived and checked the transaction log, they told her she only made 1 purchase. She argued that she could feel the second charge spiritually. One cop sighed and said, "Your spirit is wrong." She slapped the counter and yelled, "Arrest him or I'll sue the state." They arrested her instead. Story 26. I was working at a farmer's stand when a Karen demanded a discount because her strawberries didn't look symmetrical. When I said no, she threatened to call the police. I shrugged. She dialed and claimed we sold defective produce. The officer showed up, listened, looked at the strawberries, looked at her, and asked if she was joking. She said, "I never joke about injustice." When she grabbed a strawberry and threw it at the officer to prove her point, it splattered on his vest. He blinked once and said, "Okay, that's assault with a berry." She wasn't laughing. Story 27. At the library where I used to work, a Karen started screaming because someone dared whisper near her table. She demanded silence even though she'd been talking loudly on her phone for 20 minutes. When we asked her to keep it down, she called the cops and told them we were harassing a vulnerable woman. The officers showed up. They asked what happened. A kid nearby said, "She's been yelling at us all morning." When the cops told her to leave the library, she refused and grabbed a book off the shelf, shouting, "This is my safe space." The cop replied, "Now your safe space is the back of the car," and arrested her. Story 28. When I worked retail, a Karen tried to steal a stack of shirts by stuffing them in her oversized purse, then called the police on ME because I asked her to put them back. She told dispatch I attacked her physically, which was wild considering I was standing 6 feet away behind the register. When officers reviewed the footage of her literally shoving shirts into her bag like a raccoon, they turned to her and asked why she lied. She screamed, "I was testing you people." They said, "You failed your own test," and put her in cuffs. Story 29. At a family park, a Karen called the cops because someone else's toddler was breathing too loudly near her picnic table. The officers showed up assuming it was a medical emergency. Instead, they found her standing on a bench pointing at the child like he was a demon. When they explained that toddlers breathe loudly because they're toddlers, she started screaming that they were ignoring a public threat. When she refused to calm down and tried to grab the kid's stroller for evidence, they arrested her immediately. Her only words were, "This is a gesm in reverse." Story 30. I once saw a Karen in a parking lot call the police because someone parked next to her too closely, even though the cars weren't touching. She accused the driver of vehicular intimidation. When officers arrived, she tried to demonstrate by throwing her shoulder into the other car's door, claiming it pressed into her spirit. The officer said, "Ma'am, the only thing pressing is our patience." She tried to shove him too. That was the end of her afternoon. If you enjoyed, make sure you subscribe for more.